Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Carl Block. Carl is a partner in the law firm of Loeb & Loeb here in Los Angeles, California. He will be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Listen, learn, and enjoy as he leaves no stone unturned during deep conversations with some of today's most amazing business leaders. Welcome to the show.
So let's talk about ARM for a minute. And you come to ARM. I think you probably can anticipate some of the things I'm going to ask you about, but it's just such a unique situation for you to come to a company that basically is headquartered in the UK. Every other company you worked for was here. And you bring these rich experiences that you had from Amazon, Groupon, and Splunk. So why don't you tell us, now that you've had all this experience, what your leadership style is for your team at ARM and how you motivate people?
Sure. From my leadership style, as I mentioned earlier, my DNA was mutated at Amazon for, to maybe put that in a techie strange approach, or way to characterize it. But the way I was taught very much at Amazon, and it's exactly how I still operate, was I remember wanting to become a vice president. I think we only had like 60 vice presidents in the whole company in 2006 when I was up for VP. And at Amazon at the time, you had to be followed by someone for a year, and they would observe and they would take notes. And it was kind of like, anytime, it's like someone just like, it was kind of an interesting process. And it was, it was a very high bar. It was probably a little silly, but whatever. And, but there was really two things that you got rated on, and that was to get to being a senior leader. So at least you'll call it VP or something, where you have a large organization and you truly are leading a large group of people. We were measured on two criteria. You had to hire and develop the very best people. So that there's a whole bunch that goes into how do you actually identify, interview, find, and hire great people. But then how do you actually retain them, develop them, teach them, and then develop followership? So there's a whole bunch embedded in all of that. But that was one. And then two, and this one was the one that was probably even more unique, was it was just all about inspection. And what that meant is you have the ability to micromanage anyone on your team. But of course you don't do that, because one, not only is it annoying, it's also not a good use of your time. And so what you have to do is, if let's say you've hired this great team. So as the CFO, it means I got to have a great chief accounting officer, my FP&A leader, maybe some divisional CFOs, maybe a treasurer, tax, internal audit, and so on. All those leaders, I need to go hire folks that know how to do that better than I do. But I also have to be able to go and do reviews where I can inspect, and then I can get a spidey sense of like, have we gone deep enough on the SOX, control testing? Have we really looked around corners and thought about what could bite us next year that may not be in our current, key risk control environment summary? And so to do that across a very wide spectrum of areas, it means that, it just takes a long time to probably have built up some of the capability and competence in those areas. But then two, to actually really be able to go area by area and then have a good sense for where are things tight and where are they not. And so while they're two, kind of simple objectives, they do take a lot to be able to satisfy. But that is very much then how I try to lead my team. And so, for example, when I came in, I've had this at a couple companies. I've had instances where people are used to, hey, can you come approve this PO? And I'd be like, sure. Why wouldn't you I just get the email? I get why are you talking to me about it? And they're like, well, prior person only approved POs on the last Friday of every month. And I was like, well, why would that be? He's like, well, because, then you could look at there's a bunch of reasons for it. And I'd be like, well, that seems kind of like a bureaucratic or slow, or like that could really grind everything to a halt. Okay, fine. So there's just like, you start to look at how like different people have different approaches. My general view is you need to, you do, it sounds super simple, but you really do need to hire an amazing team and then just let them run. And again, my approach is I want people in every area of the business are better than I am. And one of the things another thing from Amazon that we built there that was pretty unique was called bar raisers. And that was in every area you were supposed to, I was actually the first bar raiser in the finance group in the early 2000s. And what the job was is you would be on every interview loop of a certain level. And your job was to really, really test for the key kind of culture traits, experiences, and whatever you want. And you were supposed to be very, very comprehensive. And then you had basically carte blanche to say yes or no to any candidate, even if it was, if it wasn't your candidate. And let's say someone wanted to hire someone who was an expert, and this person was an expert, and that person really wants to hire this person, and maybe it's even their friend or they worked with them in the past. You could come in and say, nope, veto. And so, it could be a little obnoxious, but it was something we took seriously. So that kind of approach, though, is something that I also try to make sure we bring of like, let's really, really make sure we're adding people that are raising the bar and we're going to be able to get leverage from them. And so that's probably the single, that's the most important aspect from a leadership perspective, I think.
Oh, look, I would say that sadly, not everybody is comfortable hiring people that might be smarter, more effective, or have better skills than a leader. But it often works if there's compatibility, of course, but it often works. So that's great. And it must be fun. It must have been fun to help build your team and integrate some of these people.
Well, to be like so then occasionally I'll get asked like, how do you measure success? I'm like, well, for me personally, it's really easy. I've been a CFO or been in finance now for 30 some odd years. And I've been a CFO now for the past 14 years. So one simple measure of success is how many people that have worked on my teams have become CFOs. Like, that's a good one. And so I actually went and looked a little while ago, and I think last I checked, it's about 25. It's like that's 25 great. CFOs. I was like, great. Well, that means are they CFOs because they work for me? Of course not. But there's a lot of people that have been able to use an organization that I managed that was a platform for them to grow and jump from. And like, that to me is a great sign of success. One of the things I also tell when I came into this company at ARM, and I know it was kind of unusual for folks, is I said, we are going to be so focused on hiring and developing people that if the next best development opportunity is for someone to leave because I don't have a role big enough for them, then we will do it. And that was kind of like, people were like, what? Wait, you mean if someone's a top talent person, you're going to help them leave the company? And it'd be like, well, yeah, because if you're truly true to the people, you're going to be true to the people, which means, you're going to help them say, what is your career objective? And can I help you satisfy that career objective or not? So.
No, I think that what you just said doesn't get emphasized enough. And I think that sometimes people lose sight of the fact that you really want to like your boss, you want to admire your boss, you want to think that your boss has your back, and that you're not just grist for the mill and you're going to be chewed up and spit out, and that you're fungible. So it's actually a pretty savvy strategy to do something like that. And
the other thing I would tweak is I kind of see it a little bit like parenting, and that is being best friends with your kid isn't always the best thing. 100%. And so like, I am friends with a lot of my staff, but I'm not friends with all of them. And like, my view is that's not my primary goal. Now, that could be a byproduct, and we may just see the world eye to eye. And certainly when we get together, I try to make sure there's camaraderie in the team, gets along and whatnot. But like another topic, I think having civil discourse that's productive is amongst the most important things you can ever have in a team. So people feel, comfortable enough to tell you, I think we're doing something crazy here. And then you can actually have us, great, tell me why, let's go through it. And then, and if they have a good point, you should be able to say, wow, that you're right. That's exactly right. Let's change our, so that's the other thing is I think it's hard as the leader to, there's an old school point of leadership, which basically says the leader's always right, and I think there's a more realistic point of leadership that says that's crazy. How could you always be right? If you're always right, you either you're focused on a very narrow set of areas, or you're probably not cognizant of what's really going on in the world, because how could you be?
Or you have the wrong people around you
Yep.
who are afraid to do that. And I mean, what you're basically saying is the baseline is mutual respect. And if you become friends with some of these people, great. But if you don't, if there's mutual respect and there's discourse, and you encourage people to feel empowered enough to say, hey, look, Mr. CFO, I'm not sure this is the right direction for us. Yeah. And you have the courage to say, I want to hear you out. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great culture that you have.
I would say part of it's culture, courage, but I think part of it's just like responsibility. Like if you're going to hire someone in a senior role and you're not going to hear them out, then geez, like, it'd be hard to, I wouldn't respect that person. So I mean, maybe the simplest thing I follow is I just talk to people the way I expect to be talked to. And
that makes sense. But I think you do have the courage. I have to give you credit. Not everybody does. All right. So look, I just want to talk about a little bit about the IPO history here, because my recollection is that ARM went public in a year where there might have only been a couple of IPOs. It wasn't the greatest IPO market. And because you were headquartered in the UK, there was a lot of discussion. Should you be listed over there? Should you be listed here?
Yep.
Why don't you just enlighten people? Because you're not going to see a lot of companies, ARM size, that are going to face this.
Yeah, I think, so first let's talk about the market. I mean, when I first was made aware of the ARM opportunity, I knew a little bit about the company. I do think it's a pretty misunderstood company. It was one of the best business models I'd ever seen. I knew a little bit about that, but when I kind of dug in, I was like, wow, it's a pretty special company. But two, it was 100% owned by SoftBank, which, there's almost like a gate. Certain types of, people and personalities are going to say that's really exciting for me and that's going to work for me. I'm not sure what that means for me. Maybe I'm not really certain, or nope, just it's not the right environment for me. So for me, I had actually worked at a SoftBank portfolio company, and so it was. Actually, I had been on the board of Coupang, which was one of their larger vision fund companies. So it was a. So I already had very good understanding of SoftBank and felt like that was actually something that was probably more either positive or more to learn more about, but it wasn't a negative for me at all. So that's one. And then two, I would say the company is one of these usual, I kind of made maybe a reference to the fact that the public markets love companies that don't really need capital. That's just kind of the way, it's kind of the funny, the silly irony of the thing. Now, of course, you want to go public because you can lower your cost of capital, typically. And there's a variety of reasons to go public. In this case, the company had already been public. It went public in 98. It was public for 18 years until 2016, got acquired by SoftBank. Experimented with a bunch of things. They were private for 7 years because I think it took a while to kind of find their footing in some of the different areas. They really just needed to diversify the business. And so, so what became clear is the company had diversified its business and it really had a great trajectory in front of it. So that was clear to me. That was exciting. I think second, that the company already, they were already very profitable. I mean, when it was taken private, it had a 52% EBITDA margin. So it was actually one of the most, I think the most profitable, certainly the most profitable company over $1 billion in all of semis. So it's so it already kind of had that going for it. And so it kind of checked the boxes of, okay, the last time I took a company public, i.e. Groupon, this had about as much risk and about as much uncertainty. And so my thought was, geez, if I'm ever going to take another company public, it's got to be quite a bit different probably than Groupon. Let's see if I can remember what I learned or the pains and mistakes that we made and I made, and what can I do to try to right some of those. And so ARM kind of fit a bunch of those things personally, and obviously the business was just in a great position, which was what it was going to take to try to help, whether we unlocked the IPO market or whether or not we just got out with a few other companies, whatever you want to call it. There wasn't a lot of companies going public. So that at least was the setup. Now, because the company had previously, the history was it had gone public on the London Stock Exchange,
Yeah.
and then it actually had a secondary listing or a dual listing on the NASDAQ later. So the question then was, well, obviously you just want to do a dual listing from the start. Well, that's super complicated, especially because, well, if you do a dual listing, which one are you, a US listed company or a UK? Well, if you're UK, you got to be on IFRS versus GAAP. Well, if you're in the US, you got to be GAAP. Well, then how are you going to deal with the IFRS? So that, and then you start looking at related party transaction rules are very, very different. The governance rules are all very, very different. And so it pretty clearly, there was a lot of administration that was going to go into it. So then the question is, okay, if there's a lot of additional cost, then why do a dual listing? Well, one of the primary benefits is all the employees. We have a bunch of employees. That are based in the UK. So clearly having a stock that's in pounds is going to be a heck of a lot easier for them. So that's a benefit. Also, we're a top 10 company in market cap, at least in the UK. And so, so there's certainly other aspects that are beneficial, for our presence in the UK. But there's still a lot of costs and a lot of complexity. So eventually what we decided to do is let's go public in the US. We talked to investors. Investors basically said, the markets are the markets. Honestly, it doesn't make any difference whether we buy your stock in one exchange versus another. I mean, we talked to probably 10 of the largest. They all said the same thing. We even talked to investment banks. They all said the same thing. So regardless of whatever the maybe politicians would say, I would say that the people who buy stocks, they don't care. So we said, okay, great. Let's simplify this. Let's go public in the US. Let's go public. Eventually we chose the NASDAQ, which is where we had been before. And then we could always decide somewhere down the road, do we want to then add a dual listing component later? And then, let's also see maybe some of the rules will become a little simpler and less burdensome. Because honestly, adding a secondary listing or adding a dual listing later is less work than doing it all at the same time. So that was ultimately the math or the calculus or the decision criteria we went through. Seems to have been fine. I don't think there's any, we haven't really had any reasons why we regret that decision at all. But it's certainly something we'll keep an eye on in the future. And certainly, different administrations in the UK, there's now been a couple of them. I think when we first started the process, it was Theresa May. We're now a couple past that administration. And, there's always been some discussions and reasons and things they'd like us to think of. But for the most part, we've just focused on what's best for our business. And down the road, we'll certainly think about it. But those were the factors that we considered.
And it must be interesting, though, in that, you're well known in the UK. So there's a little bit of pride maybe in political circles. We've got to get them listed here on our exchange. And that must have been fun to have meetings with senior politicians in the UK about that. I don't expect that over here you would have seen people at that level talking to you about it. So
yeah, we're definitely whenever I go back to the UK, probably at least once every 2 months, if not more. The recognition of ARM there is quite different. In the Bay Area, people don't even really know. I mean, our U.S. headquarters is in the Bay Area. Most people don't really know that. What's ARM? Oh, it's Advanced Risk Machines. Oh, well, what's that? And so so there's no doubt there is just a, it's definitely yeah. So those are the reasons why I think it still makes sense to look at a dual listing somewhere in the future, and we will.
Sure. Okay. So, you're obviously very happy where you are, and what are you excited about for the future?
Well, so I joined the company, and technically I joined in the first week of November of 22. Mm-hmm. About 20 days after I joined, there was what's known as the Chat GPT moment. and that kind of set off a set of hype. And I mean, really, that like everyone now, everyone talks about NVIDIA. Well, NVIDIA at that time was a couple $100 billion company. And then I think it was March or May or June was when all of a sudden they had the blowout quarter when everyone, all of a sudden they're selling tons of H100s, Hoppers, and GPUs. And then, and that in 23, and then they're kind of off to the races. So then they've had this, just incredible, kind of 1.5 year trajectory since then. So all of that is like the proof points that we've been talking about AI for a long time, but AI is now, it's now at a level where it's beyond a concept. People are now seeing it and interacting with it and generally getting kind of blown away by it on a daily basis. There's a new version, the newest version of ChatGPT is pretty incredible. Or there's, you can go use, there's a whole bunch, there's so many different apps and different services to use that generally are incredible. And so what's cool is that ARM truly is in the center of all of it. And the reason we're in the center of it is we design the CPU. So first, we're a compute platform. And so what is compute? Well, compute is generally, it's a CPU plus a neural engine or a general purpose, an accelerator. And so when people talk about a GPU is basically a very, it's an accelerator that sits on top of a CPU. That's fundamentally what it is. And so sometimes you hear different leaders talking about the CPU is dead and it's all about the GPU. Well, it's not really technically possible. It'd be kind of like saying, how does the body, the CPU is the brain. And so the body doesn't work that well without a brain. Now, the GPU could be the muscle and the, and the kind of the brawn, but it has to have the brain. All software is processed by the CPU, all operating systems, all of that is processed by the CPU. So we're the most ubiquitous CPU designed in the world. The kind of alternative is x86. And while that's a very prevalent architecture historically for Windows PC, had been historically for servers, and really most of the market. Over the last 10 years, whenever you see power or compute intensity growing and compute intensity being limited because of power, you've seen folks move to ARM. So it first started in smartphones, and that started way back actually started with mobile phones back in the 2000s. Like our first huge customers were Ericsson, Nokia, et cetera. Then it happened with smartphones. And then, certainly iPhone and then Android and all the different Android, Samsung, Google, the Pixel, et cetera, all those, they're all using ARM technology. Well, then now what's happened is the world is kind of transferred to having similar constraints because of AI on all devices. So there's certainly data center constraints. So we first worked with Amazon many years ago to launch the Graviton kind of custom built chip. More recently, in the last year, there's Microsoft Cobalt, there's Google Axion, and I'll just say all the other hyperscalers have some ARM kind of custom project either in the works or already announced or whatever, and they've all talked about where they're going with that. And so we now have about a 15% share of the cloud compute market. We've told folks we expect to have a 50% share by 2030. So it's growing very, very quickly. So that's on the server side. Now that's on the CPU side. So if you look at NVIDIA, for example, you would say Grace Hopper or Grace Blackwell. The CPU built on ARM, that's Grace. And then Blackwell, it used to be Hopper, now Blackwell, that is the GPU. That's the system that's attached to the CPU. So in every Grace Hopper or Grace Blackwell, ARM's in that device. Every iPhone or every Android phone, ARM's in that device. Every Amazon instance that's on Graviton, ARM. And they're moving, I think now they're at over half their deployments are Graviton, and they're moving far beyond half over time. And so same in auto. Now in auto, when it used to be cars had maybe hundreds of chips, now they have thousands of chips. If it's an EV, and especially if it's going to be a self-driving EV, then it has a significant amount of chips. All of the digital cockpit and dashboards, as well as the ADAS, which is the kind of the driver assistance and safety systems, the vast majority, 60 to 80%, depending on the car and the maker, they're all using ARM technology. And so that's a huge growing area. And then now you have this IoT and connecting all these different devices. And I'd say AI is kind of reigniting that whole discussion about how are you going to have all these connected devices. The vast majority, like think of it that 80+% of those devices are all also built on ARM, because again, if it's battery constrained, you need the most power efficient CPU and GPU, which we actually build the most successful small factor GPU that goes in IoT, smartphones, etc. And so that's what ARM does. And so that's why everything that's happening in the world of AI, we're kind of in the middle of all of it. And so that certainly sets us up. If you have any excitement about AI, then by default, you would have some excitement about ARM's future prospects.
Very, very well said. And I think, when you talked about the business model, I'm assuming, I don't want to put words in your mouth, when you make these great GPUs and CPUs and you license the technology to, your smart guys, and you license your technology to other smart guys and gals, then you can see what they create. And like you said, you're in the center of it, but you don't have to think of every possible AI use and AI application. You license, your state-of-the-art GPUs and CPU technology, and other people go create.
So at a really high level, the way the business works, we have two components of revenue. We have license revenue and royalties. Mm-hmm. So license, think of that as outsourced R&D.
Sure.
Funny is, we have, thousands and thousands of patents and all this IP, but we have a very small legal team. So we're not out like suing people for patent infringement, because that's not really how it works in semiconductors. We've just developed all of the technology that if you use us, typically it'll probably cost you about 1/10 of what it would cost if you wanted to try to go build it yourself, just on the CPU design and probably the GPU, maybe an MPU, a neural processing unit, and even some of the interconnect and components that you would need to build the SoC, the system on chip. So that is what we sell folks. We typically will sell it then, it can be expensive, but relative to the cost of building your own and starting from scratch, it's much, much less.
That's why they're buying from you.
And that's why they buy it from us. So then what happens is if they buy access to this technology and they go design something, let's say it's a phone, typically you release new phones every year, you're probably going to buy a license and maybe turn that into a design win, and then ultimately a new product, whether it's a new Galaxy, a new, whatever. We'll probably get royalties from that within a year. If it's in servers, it could be a couple of years. If it's in auto, it's probably 3, maybe 4 years. If it's an IoT, it's anywhere from 2 to 5 years as to when that will turn into a product. But on every one of those royalties, we have royalty rates that tie to how much technology is going into the product. And so it's a little bit, it's an interesting business. In the semiconductor industry or in the hardware industry, like probably one of the larger royalty businesses had been Dolby in the past. And so now when you look at, outside of that, you would say, well, like the music industry or, any of the entertainment industry. So we have the same type of component where we have royalties that go back 30 years. And so our earlier technologies, we still get paid on, and we just get checks, and it's all, it's basically 99.9% margin, because I have a royalty audit team and collections team, and that's it. There's no support, there's no whatever.
Understood.
So now as you build the new, so one of the decks, the slides that was in our IPO deck was the royalties, because they have such long cohorts and they tend to pay out over, decades in many instances, they kind of just layer on top and they don't decay. They just kind of layer on top. So what happens is you develop new technologies, and now we have what's called V9, which is what all of our partners that are building AI capable devices, they generally need the security protocols that come with that. And they also need some of the architectural aspects that go into that technology that's way more efficient than the last generation. And so they're going to go buy this new technology. And of course, that new technology costs X% more than the last one, which costs more than the one before that. So it is from a business model perspective, it's pretty special.
Sounds like a great gig. And by the way, we could even do another little podcast just on this and how that works out. But let's pause that for a sec. So step away from the semiconductor chip business. You've seen a lot. You've seen Splunk use AI. You've seen other companies use AI. What do you think about, and again, just as Jason Child, not necessarily as CFO of ARM, what do you see out there that really excites you about AI and what you see as risks?
So I think, I think there's two ways. There's two interesting things about AI, about where it's going. I think there's the shorter time horizon piece that folks talk about, which is how is it going to affect productivity? And so a lot of people, if you watch CNBC, they'll argue like, is Microsoft Copilot fast enough, or is Salesforce doing this, or so-and-so have some sort of a technology that allows you to reduce your support or call center costs or whatever. I think that's interesting. I don't think that's the big thing. I think that's like a near-term interesting approach. I think the stuff that's super interesting is more on this, they call it artificial superintelligence. And a lot of the projections are we're probably going to be seeing artificial superintelligence. If you just look at how quickly ChatGPT is growing from a kindergartner to a high school to now a college student to like we're now just about a PhD student. We're a couple of years away from having bots effectively that are better than any researcher that any company has. And once you can actually say, let's go release 2,000 bots to go look at whatever cancer or whatever protein folding capability and technology and outcome that could come from whatever, or trying to solve whatever climate, kind of technology possibilities may exist, or, renewable fuel sources or whatever. Like that is where I expect we're going to unlock, insane amounts of productivity and breakthrough. Like that's and that's probably 3 to 5 years away. But that's the stuff that I'm probably most excited about, because that's where it's beyond, an app that does something. It's really cool that ChatGPT talks to me with tonality and it sounds like her. That's kind of cool, but it's like it's still an app, and it's not truly dramatically changing my life. But once I actually have breakthroughs in science and technology that fundamentally change how we live, that's the stuff that not that far away. That's the stuff that excites me.
And that's a great summary. Okay, so the curveball question for you. Okay, you are Commerce Secretary of the United States. And, to me, it's a good question for you because you've been in so many companies, you've been in a lot of tech. So you're living in a world where we have this rapid technology growth. We, in theory, have a multitude of industry segments in the United States. What do you want to do if you're in charge of that?
It's a great question. First I'd preface the question by saying, I'm not the Commerce Secretary because I'm probably not, I'm not qualified in terms of at least having, lived the daily life of the challenges those guys are dealing with. But, what I can tell you is I do feel like there's, the problem, as a CFO, I deal with regulation, I deal with, red tape. And, honestly, the way I think about it is things that are written, laws and regulations that are written with good intentions, but generally are surrounded by what did the, less than 1% bad apples do to kind of create some sort of an unintended externality or consequence that means that it's not quite, maybe having the effect that we wanted. So I think, like if you look at like recent things like CHIPS Act or import-export bans from China, or, look at the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the EV credits. I think those things all were implemented with good intentions. I do think there's externalities with all those things. And I think there's a number there. While there's some positives, there's also a bunch of negatives. And so I do find, it's challenging, especially because the Commerce Secretary has to think about the US. They don't have to think about the global aspect. But certainly there's a current, kind of focus on kind of reducing globalization and focusing on, kind of like just evaluating a particular country, which, I think those are fine approaches. However, historically, those typically have led to inflation, things like tariffs, things like restrictions, and we just have come off of, crazy record inflation. And I think that's something that we're probably all scared about. What would happen if we implement, various approaches that are going to lead to significant inflation, even though it might theoretically create jobs. It may create jobs in the short term, but those jobs may be at risk if it creates significant inflation. And next thing you know, the purchasing power goes down a bunch, and pretty soon some of these industries see big slowdowns, and it didn't create the jobs that you hoped. So it's a really tricky job, and it's really tricky to figure out, like, what really are you solving for, and what's the best way to measure success, especially when all these things are a political process, which means nothing's ever perfect. You're always having to solve for, some sort of compromise. And the question is that compromise going to create unintended consequences that are going to be negative? I think of technology and politics as being, if you get it right, you go 2 steps forward and 1 step back. If you get it wrong, you get 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And if you really mess it up, you just go backwards a couple steps.
That's a fair statement. So I'm going to tell you why I asked you this question. Sometimes I wonder about that process for the same reasons you do. And what I'm going to say is you've been in companies that were rapid growth companies. You've been in companies that were mature companies. You've been in companies where, you're doing state-of-the-art stuff, where you need to be around smart people and you need to confront challenges and think about how to solve them when you may not have 3 or 4 or 5 years to do it.
Yep.
And if you were Commerce Secretary, and I'm really not blowing smoke, if you said, I know a lot of smart people, and I know a lot of smart, successful people, and what jobs are realistic to create this country that give us a competitive advantage, and how do we do it? And where are their weaknesses so that we can attack them?
Yep.
And you not having to have all the answers by yourself, but having really a coterie of really, really smart people that you could talk to say, how do we get this done? What do we need to do to get from point A to point B? So totally with you on all the other things you said too, about international trade and what happens when you make artificial jobs. That's absolutely a concern. Mm-hmm. But I also think you would have a perspective of saying, I solve problems and I don't have to do it by myself. And I talk to smart people and we come up with good ideas.
Yep. Well, I will say, those are all great points. My happy spot is working with really smart people that are smarter than me. And so the way I've generally, in my career, I've tried to work with CEOs that honestly have access to parts of their brain I would never have access to. I always like to say, any company I go to, if I'm ever a candidate to be CEO, then I've joined the wrong company. And so in this case, I would be like, so the Commerce Secretary needs to also have a great boss. And so as long as you have the right person who has the right boss, and then the Commerce Secretary could be the partner, and then together you can go figure this out, that's how we'll get to the right answer. So we'll see. We'll find out here next month, right?
I hope so. So look, I think the viewers and listeners here are really going to be happy that you came on. I think there's so much to learn about your experiences. And I think this is a very, very healthy discussion and getting your insights. And I think everybody's going to be very pleased to see this. And we at the show really, really appreciate you coming, Jason.
Thanks for the time. It was a lot of fun, Carl.
No, of course, my pleasure. Thanks for tuning in. If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.